The Lunchtime Forum with me, Cath Boy, here on Seven Waves, 92.1 live across the Wirral. We are the only community radio station on Wirral, and we have a lot of local groups and associations coming in to have a chat with us, including Riverside Writers. I've got Adele Cosgrove-Bray with me, and also Tim Hume from the group. They're meeting on Monday. They have their monthly meeting on Monday at 7:30 on West Kirby Library. We've already heard a short story from Tim. Adele, what have you brought with you today?
Today I've got a story for you called Frog. It's a modern day fairy tale set here on the Wirral, and it involves a lot of history, local history, because as you know, on the Wirral it goes back to the Celts, the Vikings, the Romans, the Normans. They've all been here at some point.
Go on then.
Okay, Frog. Frogs are everywhere in my garden. There used to be a well here, one of those picturesque affairs with a bucket on a rope which you could wind up and down using an iron handle. The well was very deep and smelled of sour mud and rancid weeds. I doubt if anyone in living memory had drunk from it and survived anyway. Perhaps that's an unfortunate remark. When the well was drained, human remains were found down there amongst the fetid slime and Tudor brick. Not just one skeleton either, but 17. The well is gone now. My concrete and steel garage stands where it used to be. Sometimes, if there's been a particularly heavy downpour, the underground stream which used to feed the well comes bubbling up through the sodden red clay to form a temporary pond beside my garage. I abandoned all vain attempts to cultivate a garden there, and now ferns, yellow flag iris and bog myrtle have free rein. The frogs seem to like it that way. I can recall with perfect clarity how, as young children, my brothers and I would drop little pebbles into the red sandstone well so we could count down the seconds to each splash. Then we'd run off to enact imaginary battles between the Cornovii Celts and the Roman 12th Legion Valeria Victrix, or the Vikings who had dwelt here centuries ago. As children, we used to look for ancient magic down the well, which local folklore insisted was a fairy well. From our sticky outstretched palms, a penny toffee or chunk of melting chocolate would be cast into the well as sacrificial payment for any wishes which might be granted. Sometimes a big frog would hungrily snatch one of our innocent offerings and then dive back below the fuliginous water. None of our wishes came true. Perhaps this was a blessing in disguise, as our Uncle Holland believed that wishes can be dangerous things, as you can't be sure how they might be answered. Plenty of other local people ignored his sagacious advice, however, and on the spring equinox a veritable stream of freshly polished copper coins would be sacrificed to the well by a welter of visiting pilgrims. I used to wonder what the frogs made of this onslaught. Did they ever get knocked unconscious by tumbling tuppences? There were always frogs in the well. They were big frogs with creamy bellies and almost human eyes, just like the ones which live in my garden now. When the well was drained, conscientious conservationists abseiled down with buckets and nets. All the frogs they caught were then released into my garden. One of the frogs was bigger than the rest and seemed remarkably self-assured as it squatted nearby to observe the forced eviction. It was the conservationists who discovered the first human skeleton. The frogs were completely forgotten in the subsequent pandemonium. Yellow police line tape was strung up. Uninvited uniforms trampled through my privacy for weeks. TV cameras and mock solemn journalists vied for gruesome footage and fresh quotes. I remember how the old people of West Kirby used to warn children to keep away from the well. The quiet fairy magic within the ebony water would lull an unsuspecting person to sleep, they'd explain with wide, laughing eyes. And when this sleeper awoke, they'd be a fairy's prisoner for all time, forced to live out eternity as a slave. Uncle Holland always insisted that fairies lived on Caldy Hill. They came here from Eire at least 1,000 years ago, he told me, and took a shine to the woods and patch of purple heath on the hill's summit. Some people used to call our Auntie Kettle a witch because she spoke to invisible people. Her name wasn't really Kettle, of course, but she was always putting the kettle on her, so the nickname stuck. Auntie Kettle had married into the Smiths, an ancient family who had continued their traditional trade as blacksmiths since the time of the Cornovii Celts, or at least this was their proud claim. Blacksmiths worked magic with fire and ore, and many people believe they first learned these skills from the Faeries. Yet Thor was a blacksmith too, and Wirral soil is rich with the bones of Thor's progeny. Toland Smith had tolerated his young wife's witchy ways because such things ran in his family. Toland's ancestors had formed the iron handle for the well. It had been Toland himself who had voluntarily maintained the structure of the well, even into his extreme old age. It's the only way, he'd explain to anyone who asked why he bothered, to keep the fairy magic from escaping. Everyone thought he was loopy, of course, in a harmless, eccentric, terribly English way. The skeletons, recently found in the glutinous, reeking mud in the bowels of the fairy well, proved to be all males, their ages ranging approximately from early teens to mid-30s. None of the remains indicated any sign of illness. Most of the skeletons had been there for centuries, but 3 were more recent. One still had hair, thick black hair. Who were they? No one knew, apart from Auntie Kettle. "I told you to leave that fairy well alone," she angrily shouted at me when I visited her in the nursing home. "You could have built your stupid garage anywhere, and now the magic will get out." Yet she lived in fantasy by then, and no one had ever taken much notice of her nonsense anyway. The police wanted to ask Auntie Kettle a few questions, as the house still belonged to her and she'd lived there all her married life. Did she have any ideas about who the corpses might have been? Auntie Kettle sat imperiously on a plastic-wrapped armchair and declared, "Of course I know who those boys were. Not in person, you understand, except in Mark Horshaw's case, and him I warned to keep away. But no one ever listens to anything I say. What do I know? But I warned him after I'd caught him talking to the water down the well. Vomiting, he pretended he was doing. He never was. I know." No further questions were asked of Auntie Kettle. Investigations soon traced a Horshaw family to nearby Frankby and revealed how the now middle-aged Mark was alive and well and barely able to remember the exhortations of a mad woman. "Of course he's still alive." Auntie Kettle rolled her eyes in exasperation when I passed on the news. "Because I warned him." Old newspapers stored on microfilm at Birkenhead Library recorded that in 1824 a young farmhand had gone missing. Michael Norton had been employed by his own brother in Sorgle Massey. He vanished without warning, leaving behind a reputation for hard work and broken hearts. Another handsome man had disappeared in 1917. Dennis Russell left his new wife with a baby son, though gossip implied that he had fled to the Merchant Navy rather than accept a sedate existence in Hoylake. In 1936, dark-haired twin brothers, aged just 16, set out to harvest blackberries on Caldy Hill and were never seen again. Dale and Dean Martin had been quick-witted and lively boys, according to their grieving choirmaster. It is a cruel fact of life that, in this cold and largely indifferent world, people disappear without trace every day. Why should the secluded, sunny Wirral Peninsula be an exception to this truism? Toland Smith used to tell us stories when we were children. Auntie Kettle would be furiously knitting some mysterious garment of gargantuan proportions, while Toland sucked contentedly on his old wooden pipe and talked about the fairies that live on Caldy Hill. The Smith family of blacksmiths has always got along well with the fairies. "Tall people they are," said Toland, peering through his snowy eyebrows. "Tall and thin and very beautiful, with yellow hair and creamy skin. They can charm the green out of the grass if they choose to, and they always pay fair for a fair job. But cross them even once, and you'll meet with relentless malice the likes of which you cannot begin to imagine." Toland's head would be enfolded within a rolling tangy cloud of green-brown smoke as he'd say, "Our ancestor, Sigmund was a handsome lad, or so I was told. How should I know? Just how old do you young ones think I am? Then he'd laugh and Auntie Kettle would scowl as he'd pull out caramel sweets for us from his green cardigan pockets. Sigmund caught the eye of a fairy girl, who was beautiful even by their high standards, but she was extremely spoiled, always wanting things she couldn't have. She wanted Sigmund, but he was pledged to another. Sigmund refused the fairy, and in a rage she threw him down the well. In retaliation, the villagers hurled her down to join his corpse. And that's how it all began, Auntie Kettle would say, dropping stitches and swearing in Latin. Cross the fairies even once, Tolland always warned us, and there'll be murder. How does the story end, Uncle Tolland? Tell us the rest. We'd clamour for completion even though we already knew the fairy tale off by heart. He'd continue, and so, to stop herself from drowning, this fairy girl turned herself into a great big frog. She's probably still down there because fairy magic can last forever. But don't be fool enough to go leaning over the edge of the well. If she likes the look of you, her long, snaky tongue will flick up and drag you down beneath the quiet waters. Our gruesome, appreciative chorus would chirrup, "What will she do with us, Uncle Tolland?" Use her fairy magic to turn you into frogs to keep her company down there. A whole harem she has of handsome young man-frogs to keep her happy. Auntie Kettle would mutter disapprovingly, but we laughing children adored this silly tale, which we mostly forgot as we grew older and colder and drier in the imagination. But then those anonymous skeletons were reverently raised from their dank and desperate resting place. Who were they? Did their DNA match with long-forgotten faces of handsome or beautiful boys who had never come home? Who would ever really know? The well exists no more. I had it blocked up and its crumbling old walls torn down to make room for my garage. But the frogs are content. Big, creamy, yellow-green frogs with almost human eyes. In the spring, the pond, which often floods that corner of my ancient plot of land, becomes frothy with their bubbling spawn. And the frogs are everywhere now, not just in my garden. Only this week, a local boy was found face down in the nearby waters of the Burkitt stream. His Celtic logo T-shirt and long dark hair was soaked with the frog's gelatinous soup.
Adele Cosgrove-Bray from the Riverside Writers. I've said this before on the show, but I used to think fairies were really sweet little creatures. Now I know far, far better.
Fairies are not sweet. If you read ancient Celtic folklore, you realise they were anything but sweet. They were quite difficult, treacherous, awkward people.
You've shattered my illusions. We've had some emails in from Sarah, and she says, another disturbing fairy story, just the way I like it. Says Sarah.
Thank you, Sarah.
Also, Tommy's emailed in, and he says, oh, this is good. You don't get this quality of writing on radio very often. More of this kind of ting, says Tommy. Thank you, Tommy.
Thank you, Tommy.
Also, Doreen says, this is what community radio should be about, celebrating talent on the Wirral. Because there is a lot of writing talent here in the peninsula, isn't there, guys?
Oh, I think there is, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I hope we can attract some more to our Riverside Writers.
Yeah, because there's so many different events taking place.